Hello and welcome to Social Media Marketing Strategy Development. Today we're going to go over about 11 slides about how to create a social media marketing strategy at a fairly high level. Before we get into this, I just want to share um, this is something that is um, a little bit, it always evolves, it's always changing. What a social media marketing strategy looked like 10 years ago really does not look like that today. And part of that is the evolving technology. But the other part of that is thinking about who your audience is for your strategy. A lot of times, and one of the big steps in a social media marketing strategy is determining your target audience, your target market. And we also need to think about social media in terms of who your target market is when it comes to creating documentation and strategies. Because in the world of social media, we are often held on a different standard. We are always under the microscope from leadership because it is something that is hard to see the payoff, and it can be difficult to understand um, at a high level because everybody thinks that they understand what social media is, especially when it comes to for a brand. The problem is a lot of people do not, and they don't understand the nuance and the detail that goes into it. So today we're going to go through some ways to really quell those concerns and to really establish yourself as a social media strategist. Um, as we begin here, let's start with some basic terminology. Right. So, what is a social media marketing strategy? I mean, it just outlines the strategies and the individual tactics. So, difference between a strategy and a tactic. Strategy is more high level. Tactic is the individual things that go into that. Um, the strategy has both of those things for how a company is going to incorporate social media into its business. That is kind of a key definition here because you want to think about not just social media as a standalone marketing activity, but also how it is going to help the brand, how it will help the company, help the business. Organic social media on its own is not usually a revenue driving activity. However, we are at a point here with social media where it's becoming a little bit easier to explain the value proposition of what social media can do for a business. All right. So, the original version of this textbook that I used had 10 steps, and I thought that was way too much. You can't be expected to memorize them all, and some of them were, it felt like they were parsing, really separating some things that were essentially the same thing. So I have cut it down to seven. Still a good amount of steps. It's not something that you would necessarily need to memorize the order, except for really these first few. Um, in the world of social media, one of the most, and really in marketing in general, I would argue the most important thing is to know your audience, identify a target market. I do say create buyer personas, um, which is a nice to have, but a lot of times you already have that. If you're creating a social media marketing strategy for the first time and there has been previous marketing activities done, you usually don't need to recreate the wheel here. But really, you do need to go through the exercise of understanding who your target market is and who you want to, like, what you want them to do. This is going to set the stage for the remaining steps. In terms of what to know, especially for my class, you need to know that that's first. You don't really necessarily need to know the order of all the others. It's nice to know it, of course, um, but really, that is the most important thing. After that, a lot of them can be done interchangeably. I will say though, keep the platform selection for later. A lot of people like to jump in first, and they say, "Oh, we're going to start on Instagram." I've had a lot of students who I've worked with, and they've shared some of their uh, professional experience with me, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I was in charge of social media." I said, "Okay, what did you do? It's for a new company. It's just getting off the ground." He's like, "Well, I started on Instagram." I was like, "Okay, what what went into that decision?" It's like, "Well, it's Instagram. Like everybody's there," and that might be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean the brand needs to be there. Um, And Instagram's only the largest platform for a certain subset of the audience. There are lots of people out there that do not necessarily use Instagram at the same rate. Uh, when I look at these two, there are a lot of other factors that go into all of this. So let's dig in. The second step, uh, I used my example earlier when you're creating a business from scratch. However, I also think it's important that I understand that at this point, most existing companies have social media already. They've already taken action at some level. They've done social media. And what I am here to say is it's important to have an audit. You got to conduct a social media audit, if not a whole online presence audit, to really understand where that brand exists and how it has worked so far. Part of this is understanding, do we continue doing what's been working? But then it's also critical to understand, all right, who is the audience for this social network? Because a lot of times there is a fundamental disconnect and a difference between the people that follow a brand on social media and the people who are actually the customers. A lot of B2B companies see this, where the brand looks at has a relatively small following, and you'll see, all right, the audience is largely employees, friends and family, and some other people who may have seen it in the news, right? People that like this industry, that like this type of content. Again, that's all well and good, but is that then working for your strategy? Is that strategy working for your business? That's where you end up with empty numbers, and that's something that we'll talk about at a later time. But when it comes to conducting a social media audit, that's where you can really figure out these first steps and figure out how the brand exists today. So I like to ask some of the questions. Is there a positive or negative sentiment about the brand? That can be difficult to gauge. I would guess 90% of people that are going to watch this and are going to conduct an audit are not going to find any sentiment about a brand. There's going to be people sharing feedback and sharing thoughts in the comments and maybe sharing posts, but it's not like, whoa, there's overwhelmingly negative feedback. This isn't the airline industry we're talking about. For the most part, we're talking about companies that are either B2B, where there's very rarely any brand sentiment at all, or in the B2C space, where it's usually positive, unless your brand just lives on Twitter or X. That's where really a lot of the vitriol exists, as it does on Facebook. But it's just kind of an interesting time to measure how a brand is performing online. Now, if you have a larger company and there is a lot of social media activity, then yes, you're going to need to understand the sentiment. What do people think about this? Is it positive? Is it negative? And think about it platform by platform. A social media audit is not something to just look at holistically. This is something you need to understand at an individual account level. So that's where you compile them all, and you can do this on various platforms, on various programs like a Hootsuite or a Sprout if you have it, or you can do it yourself. Create a spreadsheet. Also, there's plenty of AI tools that will also help with this. Just be careful what you're plugging in. When you are using an AI platform and connecting a social media account, you need to understand what you are giving them permission to do. Sometimes, personally, I recommend just downloading all of your analytics right from your native platform, which we'll talk about later, and then uploading just the raw numbers into a program where it can assess them. That usually does it. Then you can get an average engagement rate, see what kind of impressions you're getting, and also, what if you have video, especially, like, are people watching it? How long is it? Also, what's the average watch time? Because as you will see, I believe it's in the next couple of videos, video views in particular can be very deceiving. Finally, with the social media audit, what is the not just which platform performs best, but what types of posts are performing the best. And I'm not talking video or links. Um, I'm talking about like pillars of content. What I do for every one of my clients is when I start a strategy, I have content pillars. So all the content that I share fits into one of these major pillars that connects back to the brand and the mission and the larger organizational strategy. But if you're looking back on posts, it's important to also put them into buckets and figure out what's performing better and what's performing worse. The reason I say this is a lot of companies, especially in the B2B space, and a lot of those who focus on LinkedIn, which has become a greater focus here in the mid 2020s, they like to share a lot of company announcements. Somebody gets promoted, they hire somebody, somebody retires, and those are overwhelmingly well performing posts. They always do really well. They are people centric. They are, the people that are the subject of the post, they'll share it with their friends. And it's interesting because it's the reverse on often on LinkedIn or on Instagram, for example, or Twitter or X or these other platforms, because that is where the engagements don't work as well, right? It's like, oh, happy 10-year anniversary to so and so. Instagram, that might just get 5 or 10 likes. On LinkedIn, that could get like 50 to 100, along with all sorts of comments, because that's where that person's it really depends on where that person's network lives on social media. And the reason I mention this is if you just take LinkedIn again, for example, take it all the LinkedIn posts that your brand publishes. Say you have an engagement rate of 9.5%. Really, that's really good for LinkedIn. Anything above 5% is good. But then you go in and you say, okay, now let's look at each type of post. Any post about people, about anniversaries, about retirement, new hires, all that. Wow, the engagement rate's up to 30%. And then you say, okay, here's company news. Okay, we just secured a new client. We're going to be at the New York Stock Exchange, like things like that. Oh, that's only a 3% engagement rate. And then you see here's another pillar of content that's about news coverage that we have. Okay, that's a little bit higher. That's like 15. And then you say, okay, here's something that's more of a salesy post, right? That we're trying to convert people here. Oh, that's 0.5%. Once you see those differences, when you're auditing a brand, especially on any platform, really, any individual platform, you can see what works and what doesn't work. And if the salesy stuff isn't flying, even though that's the stuff that should allegedly lead to revenue, that's where you need to recalibrate and figure out how can we make this work? Do we just abandon that and do we cover it up in a shroud of a personnel announcement? Do we shift the focus? What do we do? There's all sorts of directions that you can go, but the audit is really imperative for an existing brand to figure out what has worked and what hasn't worked. Because if you don't do this and you just start from scratch, you're losing out on a ton of valuable information that you can glean from these past posts. All right. Here's the first real in-depth mention of analytics. And this connects back to the strategy overall. This is, if you have to lay out the strategy into a single graphic, it's probably this, right? You have your strategy, which is something like the goals, and you have your tactics, which happens through the objectives and the metrics. This is a really important piece for my class. And I would say if there's one slide to pay attention to closer than all the others today, it's this one. So strategy starts with a goal, right? This is for a company, a fictional company that sells backpacks and bags and suitcases, travel gear. A goal in this case does not have a number. There is, I understand goals are supposed to have numbers, but really it's just it's a direction. You want to increase brand awareness. I would say more than half of companies, their goal on social media is to increase brand awareness. To increase revenue with organic social media is futile, not worth it. Maybe for paid advertising, that's different. But when you think about organic, which is what we're talking about here, not spending any money on boosting posts, on advertising, you're usually trying to increase brand awareness. But what does that mean? How do you put a number behind that? That's where the objectives come in. The objectives have numbers, and these are your KPIs. These are where you are trying to increase or decrease whatever you're trying to do. These data points that work together to lead to what your goal is. In this case, we want to grow. I mean, these numbers are kind of crazy, but um, one, follower growth. Even though I fundamentally disagree with how followers work now and how the algorithm has kind of changed the way that people consume social media, it's still a KPI. It's still something that people often do. So that is one of the KPIs in this case. After that, you have, hey, you're trying to increase engagement, right? That's, as you may recall from before, that is likes, that's comments, that's shares, uh, clicks, all of the different engagements that can be done on a post. So you want to increase engagements in addition to followers. And then you get into something a little bit more meaty, which is, hey, how much traffic are we getting from social media? This is not, by the way, these are not standard for every company. This is just an example. I would argue in today's day and age, social media is no longer as important for driving traffic to a website in terms of like links. Because if you think about it, which we'll get to later with algorithms, algorithms are deprioritizing, de-emphasizing links, external links, especially those to websites. With brands, that's not always the case, especially on LinkedIn. A lot of the work that I have done, I've seen that posts with links actually don't hurt a company page post performance. It does on a personal post performance, but it doesn't on the company page. And I think it's because companies still like to post links. Um, but again, for this exercise, we're looking at objectives where you're trying to double your traffic from on the website that comes from social media. And then finally, again, this is strictly B2C for a company that has a ton of, has an online store. It really operates strictly online. Then you could see an increase in sales from social media. I would be remiss to not put this here as an example, even though I think most people that are going to watch this video are never going to have that last piece. Things to remember on these objectives is that these are not raw numbers. You are looking at percentage increases or decreases depending on what your KPIs are. Now, the metrics, those are just raw numbers. Those are the numbers that dictate the objectives. So you think about it too, like objectives they need a time frame, as do metrics, right? Goals, increase brand awareness, that can just be in perpetuity, but objectives and metrics must be over a period of time. A lot of companies, they do monthly social media reporting. I typically do monthly. It kind of depends on the client. But I definitely don't go any less frequent than quarterly. I think quarterly is pretty good because it gives you enough content where, for example, in monthly reporting that I do, I just did one already for this past month. I had one post that did really, really well, and it brought up the obviously, like law of averages, it brought up all of the numbers overall. I actually thought the month was pretty poor, but there was one post that saved the day in the last 72 hours of the month. So I'm going to send this report off and be like, wow, executive summary, this is really good, but I'm also going to add the caveat of it was one post that did this. The more posts you have, the less of an impact those outliers will have, which is why I've kind of shifted to appreciating the quarterly post more, or the quarterly analysis, because at that point too, by that same token, one dud won't kill you. When you think about objectives, right? If you're trying to grow, if you're trying to add followers every month, if you're trying to increase engagements every month, one bad post can essentially lead to you not increasing brand awareness. because it's just not a big period of time. The way that I originally would look at this step is annually. It will take at least 6 months, if not 12 months, to show a true increase in brand awareness, or at least to show a true um to show numbers that are accurate, that are not just outliers, that aren't impacted by outliers one way or another. Again, I just wouldn't go less frequent than a month, and I think 6 months to a year is ideal. But I do this also quarterly. Um, Overall, just to kind of sum this up, every goal, there can be more than one goal, but usually it's just one when it comes to social media. You need something that um, really explains and defines what brand awareness is. Um, for me personally, it's all about the um, finding defining those KPIs as objectives. And for me, the KPIs are usually engagements. Engagement. I wouldn't say engagement rates, although that is a nice way to again eliminate outliers. But then also, I do like to look at reach and impressions. Those aren't here, but for me, um, we are at a time where we are all at the mercy of the algorithms of all these different platforms. And as long as you have a track record of maintaining a solid engagement rate, then suddenly your impressions become more important. If you can trust your abilities to create good, compelling content, then it's more about as long as you can reach the right larger audience. There's a lot of other factors that go into this. I understand. But I'm just kind of rambling here as I share kind of these details. So again, goals, objectives, metrics, critical terms. One other thing on the KPIs I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that you want to have 3 to 5 KPIs. You don't want to measure everything that you can, because you can measure dozens of things, especially on Facebook. And Facebook, if you export your data, you can export like 150 different analytics, and they get very, very tactical. It's like 3-second video views, 5-second video views, 50% completion video views. I just don't see the need to have all of that. And that's why I say 3 to 5. 3 to 5 are the metrics, by the way. If you go back, there's 4 in this example. Objectives wise, I mean, there are 4 here, and it's very much like one metric leads to one objective. Usually that's a good rule of thumb. There are some exceptions. But again, 3 to 5 metrics, which are your KPIs. Last step that I want to call out, again, I didn't call these all out today. I just want to talk about content strategy. The next video that I'm going to have is all about content. On social media, it doesn't matter how all the best practices that you follow, or if you do everything to a T based on what these platforms are telling you in terms of, use X number of hashtags and have photos with faces in them. Sure, those help, but if you don't have content that resonates with your audience, no amount of tactical best practices are going to work. The social media content strategy is imperative to a brand success. And when you think about content strategy, it's not just what it is that you're putting out there, but also how you're doing it. Here's a bunch of examples of content types you can use. But really, the way I want to wrap this up is the idea of storytelling. It's hard to define storytelling. I used to define it in my book as a social media post that is like a story. It has a beginning, middle, and end, more of a narrative form. There's characters that you connect with, and they have a rise and a fall, something like that. But we've gotten to a point now where it feels like storytelling has become the norm, especially with some brands. If you think about individual content creators, they have all adapted the storytelling techniques. Really, it, I don't. It's very difficult to integrate storytelling into a brand social media strategy, and it's also very hard to do on anything other than videos. It's hard to have photos that tell us that do really strong storytelling. But my two big takeaways on storytelling: one, and just some advantages. One is it builds community and trust because it is about that authentic connection. It's an authentic narrative that really, in a boxing term, likes to act as a jab. But then the promotions, where you talk about the brand, that's where it becomes more of a right hook. Uh, Cooking is the biggest example that I'm sure everybody knows about. Where today, if you look up a recipe online, you go to a web page, and there's always this long story about how the author, the cook or whatever, has all of these like this background information about what it is that they're making and how it connects to them on on an emotional level. And you just want to jump to the recipe. You're standing in your kitchen, you are literally at the counter ready to bake, but you need to look and see if you got all the ingredients. So, what makes that storytelling? It becomes a challenge. In cooking, especially on cooking like TikToks and Instagram, I have noticed too, people tend to go either the silent route where they don't talk about anything. They just do the cooking and that's it, really short cuts, or they go the complete opposite way and they tell a story as they do it. I've seen it both ways. Obviously, also more of a generational thing. The older audiences tend to resonate with the longer form content, whereas younger audiences prefer the get to the point. Um, but yeah, that's kind of storytelling in a nutshell. Where you want to provide something that is more of in a narrative form, and that is going to really be memorable to your audience. So, last slide. Social media requires intentionality, platform specific strategies. You need some authentic engagements, though, like the storytelling. Um, and also, I didn't talk about this, but part of it too is about consistency, which is where the strategy and the planning comes in. Where if you can create a timeline, social media calendar, it's not the best. I don't recommend creating posts 30 more than a week out, but as long as you have the topic and as a reminder, right, you need to post about such and such on this day, then you'll be able to create something that is more consistent and will begin to help you accumulate followers and people that regularly engage with your content. Because if they like it once or twice, they're probably going to like it more than that too. It's going to be important to continue to feed this. And as you analyze your content too in real time, you're going to be in a better position to succeed and help a brand reach, or not reach, but I should say, help a brand set those goals higher and higher, and have you really hit your objectives on a regular basis. So that is it for this one. Comes in at just under a half an hour, and up next we'll be talking about all the different content types. So stay tuned.